Chapter 15. Up to the Woods. A few times during the next day, which was Monday, Grover found himself thinking about Nicky as he sat in his desk at school. He wasn't thinking about her in a boy-girl sort of way. The notion of being in love never entered his mind. He was thinking about her in an interesting person sort of way. It wasn't often that he met anybody, especially a girl, who cared about things like dust mites. He was looking forward to showing her his snakes later on, after school. It would be fun to see if she was scared after all. But first he had to do some hunting. Just before 2 o'clock, he filled in the last answers on his English test and then staged a highly realistic coughing fit. "Can't breathe! Nurse's office!" he gasped, and he staggered, choking, out of the classroom. Then he slipped out a side door and trotted up Fern Street to the path that led into the woods. The forest was his second home. He knew all the trails that threaded up the mountainside. He knew the creeks and the outcroppings of rock and the places where salamanders were likely to be hiding under rotting logs. In the summer, he spent hours up here. Sometimes he scrambled through brush and waded down streams, but other times he just found a good spot and sat still. He had learned that if he sat without moving for a long time, he would see things. Animals would come out of their hiding places and potter around in the open, not realizing he was there. Once, at dusk on a summer evening, a spotted skunk walked past him, so close he could see the long curved nails on its front feet. Today he was after some dinner for his red-belly snake. The milk snake would get the baby mouse, which he was trying to keep alive so that Nicky could watch it being eaten. For the red belly, a few good-sized slugs and maybe a small salamander would do. Actually, he could get these in his own backyard pretty easily, but he wanted to go into the woods. He hadn't been for a while, because of homework and bad weather and working on jobs with his father. He missed it. He was aware that people had been talking lately about someone lurking up here, maybe a terrorist planning dark deeds, but Grover wasn't worried about him. He didn't think about him much. Talk about terrorists and war was the sort of talk that just slid off his brain. He was too occupied with his own concerns to pay much attention to it. He started along a steep uphill trail, which would take him, in 15 minutes or so, to a place where a stream rushed between shallow banks. He could get down to the water's edge easily there and find a few of the things that liked living in damp places. He'd brought a plastic jar with him to take them home in. The rhythm of his steps said, "Happy to be here, happy to be here." Rays of sunlight shot between the clouds, making spots of light like polka dots on the ground. On either side, the woods were thick, everything close in, dense, stickery, twined with vines. Here and there a bare-twigged mountain ash with red berries like decorations. The whir of bird wings rushed up from bushes as he passed. He was always looking beside the trail, which grew narrower as he climbed higher, for the holes and burrows that an animal might be living in. Holes, rotting logs, sun-warmed rocks, all those were places favored by snakes, and therefore favored by Grover. As he walked, he hummed a little tune, an ambling, careless tune that went with being happy and trotting along and knowing what he was doing. And his eyes scanned the woods and the ground for anything of interest, and his mind traveled off where it usually did, to his plan to join the Arrowhead Wilderness Reptile Expedition this summer. It was perfect for him. Addison Pugh, a famous herpetologist, was leading it. And it was out in Arizona, where he'd never been, and where the snakes would be all different from the ones here. He would have a great time, and he would learn a huge amount, and he would meet people who could help him on the way to his career. He had to go. How could something as trivial as $375 stand in the way? It was very inconvenient that his family didn't have any spare money. On the other hand, it forced him to be creative. He felt pretty confident about the serial jingle he'd made up, and he'd solved the cryptogram and sent it in quickly. Sweepstakes weren't so promising, because winning was just luck. But he'd entered so many of them, at least 50 just in the last few weeks, that he had to win something. It wouldn't take much, just a few small prizes from 3 or 4 different contests, and he'd have enough. All these thoughts swirling around in his mind kept him a little less observant than he usually was. He was up fairly high on the mountainside now, and the trail turned into more of a dotted line up here, blocked every now and then by overgrown bushes or a fallen tree. This didn't matter to Grover. He climbed over or went around whatever was in the way. He always knew where he was. But it meant he had to watch his feet more, stepping over stuff and being careful not to trip, so at first he didn't see that something was moving farther up the mountainside, where the trees were denser. The sound of his own footsteps covered up the sound that anyone else's footsteps might have made. A few yards farther on, he came to the place where a muddy path led down the stream bank to the place he wanted to go, and there he paused for a second. That was when he heard a distant rustling, the sort of rustling that only something big makes. He froze. Without moving any other part of himself, he turned his head toward where the sound seemed to have come from. The trees and the thick undergrowth beneath them made it impossible to see very far, or at least to see clearly. All he could see was a patch of paleness far off in the distance. It moved, paused, moved again, and disappeared. He stood there for another 3 or 4 minutes, but he heard no more rustling, and saw nothing either. So he went on down the stream bank and sat on a rock by the water. Nothing large and pale lived in the woods, as far as he knew. He couldn't think what it could possibly be. Maybe some huge white bird? A stork? But why would there be a stork in the woods? There wouldn't. A ghost? He didn't believe in ghosts. Anyway, a ghost wouldn't make a rustling sound, would it? So maybe the talk about someone lurking up here was worth paying attention to after all. Grover felt a small shiver of fear. Maybe this terrorist was up here just waiting for someone to kidnap. Give me $1 million to fund my terrorist organization, or else I'll slice this boy up and scatter him in the pines. Grover put his arms across his knees and hunched down, bending his face toward the water. The stream rushed by, carrying leaves and bits of twig, making the weeds at the water's edge flow sideways. He stayed that way for a while, imagining what he would do if a terrorist stepped suddenly from behind a tree and grabbed him. The best thing would be to have a snake with him at the time, so he could terrify the terrorist with it, and startle him into letting go. A venomous snake would be best. If he didn't happen to have a snake, he'd have to struggle. Too bad he didn't know karate, or any of those other martial arts. He could kick, though. He was strong and agile, and he could bite. He pictured himself twisting like a giant boa constrictor around the terrorist and biting him in the back of the neck. It would be best, though, not to get caught in the first place. So he got busy with what he'd come for. He turned over rocks, dug the toe of his shoe into crumbling logs, lifted up sodden leaf litter, and poked sticks into holes. Before long he had some nice grubs, a millipede, 5 water snails, 2 good-sized slugs, and a small purplish salamander with gold spots on its back. He put all these in his jar and started down the trail.